I call Eugenie Sage, 5-minute call.
Tanaka, Mr Speaker, thank you. Pleased to take a brief call on the Taxation, Land Information and Offshore Persons Bill. Now, we've heard at length from Mr Bailey and Mr Bishop about why the government doesn't take the advice not only of Inland Revenue but tax specialists like Ernst & Young, and is insisting on making this legislation more complicated, creating potential loopholes and potentially increasing the compliance costs. Now, Mr Bishop said that they didn't want to increase the volume of information that people would have to provide. They didn't want people to have to worry about whether they would be taxable. And that was the reason for rejecting Inland Revenue's advice that this requirement to provide IRD numbers should apply to all transactions, because it's a basic principle of tax law, Mr Speaker, that it should be clear. But what we're having here, as Ernst & Young described it, is a confusing mix of tax, immigration and overseas investment concepts which are likely to give rise to a number of technical and practical issues. The bill is a mishmash, Mr Speaker. And because the government's rushing the legislation through, wanting to get it passed by the 1st of October, because that's when it wants the new bright line disposal test for residential properties other than the taxpayer's main home to apply, it's failing to take into account all of the concerns of submitters. It's a poorly drafted bill. There have certainly been some improvements at Select Committee, but those improvements are not enough. And the fact that there is this exemption for a main home will, as Ernst & Young said, may simply reinforce the ignorance and the lack of appreciation as to when there might be an income tax liability. And using that whole definition of main home as somewhere that a person has the greatest connection with is just another example of the law being poorly drafted. That term, greatest connection, isn't something that is used in tax law. It's not used in New Zealand law generally. So there's no common or accepted understanding of what it means and how it should be interpreted and applied. And also, for when we're dealing with tax law, something like that is far too subjective. Yes, the government is saying there will be advice provided, but this greatest connection test is likely to lead to disputes about whether someone has the greatest connection with the home that they spend the most time in, or the greatest connection perhaps with a holiday home, because they've got much more of a heart connection with the place they spend their holidays because they're much more memorable. When you've got subjective tests like that in tax law, Mr Speaker, it is not good law. It's going to lead to disputes, good income for tax lawyers potentially, but it's not clear. The Green Party is nevertheless supporting the bill because it is a very small step, and take into account Fletcher Tabato's comments, but it is a very small step to getting tighter controls on overseas investment and offshore purchase of New Zealand land, and a bit more information on that. And of course, the Green Party has been calling for a register of purchases of New Zealand land by offshore interests for some time, because it is ridiculous that we don't know that in this, the 21st century, we cannot have a register that is publicly available so that there is certainty around the percentage of New Zealand land that is being alienated to offshore interests. So while we support the objectives of the bill about obtaining more timely information from people who are buying and selling land, about improving compliance with the land sales provisions in tax legislation, the tests in the bill and the number of loopholes, the subjective nature of some of the drafting won't reduce red tape, which this government says it's about. They won't provide for better government because it is a mishmash of concepts, and it is likely to increase the compliance costs because it is confusing.
I call